All right, welcome back everyone to another edition of our ongoing cybersecurity webinar series here at the Salt Lake Chamber. I'm Nick Dunn with the Salt Lake Chamber, and today's presentation is called Securing Digital Identities. So we're going to be walking through that. Before we get started, I want to remind you all that this is the second to last presentation in our ongoing series this fall. We have one more next week. Again, these have been Wednesdays during lunchtime, so today and the next week are the last two. I want to remind you folks that there's also a Series 5 Apple Watch on the line, generously contributed by Strong Connections. We've been tracking the participants of each of these webinars, and at the end we'll do an opportunity drawing. And so people who attended the most webinars will have the most number of chances to win that Series 5 Apple Watch. So just wanted to remind you of that. We'll get to the presentation from J.R. Maycock with Perpetual Storage, presenting on securing digital identities. While he's presenting, remember to think of questions or thoughts that you have about what he's talking about. Go ahead and plug that into the Q&A feature here in the Zoom platform. At the end of his presentation, we'll have some time to take some questions from the audience and have a little bit of discussion back and forth. With that, we'll turn it over to you, JR, for presenting on securing digital identities.
Thank you very much, Nick. It's an honor to be here today. And hello to the Utah business community. Today is going to be an interesting and passionate discussion, shall we say. This is a topic around identity security that I have a lot of personal interest in, beyond just professional interest. My background is in about 15 years worth of IT administration and security architecture. The areas or different places I've been in my career include corporate environments, service providers, K-12 education, and I'm currently employed, as Nick mentioned, at Perpetual Storage Inc. We're a data storage and cybersecurity protection company located over in Little Cottonwood Canyon. So if you ever have any needs in those areas, certainly look us up. Today's talk is going to involve a few things. It's worth prefacing the content this way. Ideas today are connected to prior webinars in the series, especially the two webinars from October 14th and November 11th around securing devices at home and work. Those webinars in the past have laid out very clear patterns to the question, or answering the question of what needs to happen. Today, we're going to try and talk about how to fix the identity security gaps and why specific actions are required over other alternatives. Stuff we're going to talk about today is valid in the context of home and personal account use, and that is also valid, probably even more so, and where we're going to spend the largest emphasis today is in business and government environment use. I'll try and call out the distinctions between those realms where they're relevant, but I just want to proceed on at pace today. And there's a lot to get through, so I'm going to try and keep the clip up good and going, and we will preserve time for questions and answers along the way. Anything that comes to mind in terms of clarification of terminology or specific ways to implement these suggestions, please be sure to put those in the chat. I'd really like to analyze everyone's questions on this topic. It helps to lay some groundwork about what we're talking about with digital identities. And it's useful to contrast the digital identity concept with the physical identity concept. A physical identity for a person means their biology, cells, their consciousness, and that type of identity is very durable over time. It doesn't change throughout someone's life. It's probably best identified down to someone's DNA being unique to them and being a relatively static experience. We also do treat other entities in a legal sense as having physical presence, things like corporations or governments and municipalities. In contrast, digital identities only exists as objects and data in some kind of an information system of record. Those objects, those digital entities, have different attributes populated inside that system of record. It could be things like a display name or a contact name, primary email address, authentication secrets like passwords. And the key use of these identities is to assign permissions, to create different actions attributed to that identity, which can then change the state of data or get to different content. all these digital identities are required for authentication to be successful. Generally speaking, we don't let data simply exist that needs to be kept private without requiring some authentication to take place first. Not everything is just hanging out on the public internet. At least it's not supposed to when you're doing things right. Another very important distinction around digital identity in comparison to physical identity is that one person usually has many, many digital identities. Hundreds of accounts are possible. I think I did a survey on my own state of identity between work accounts and personal while preparing these slides and such. And I ended up at a count of 623 identities that I control directly just as one person right now today. So it can get pretty big in a hurry. Digital identities also change in context over time. As you go throughout different stages of your life and open or close bank accounts, change an email address, alter your employer, the set of digital identities that are relevant and useful to you will grow or shrink. Certain ones will leave, certain ones will be added. So they are a much more dynamic system when we're speaking of digital identity. All of this needs to be secured through behavioral practices, the use of technologies, and above all else, human attention. There is real data and real value in that data at stake. This is the matter of your finances, your business's competitiveness, your ability to have good cybersecurity practices and good hygiene, as more and more operations depend on digital data just as much as they depend on physical data. In 2020, it's unavoidable to have value wrapped up in those digital assets. So securing the identity layer is pretty much the gatekeeper in being able to have any meaningful security anywhere else. Absent this layer being successfully secured, nope, not a snowball's chance in hell. This is the core of the presentation today. I broke it down into what I could identify as 6 rules, 6 ground rules that are critical for securing identities. We're going to go through them one by one. Rule 1, the human firewall is irreplaceable and is your best line of defense. There is no technology that can substitute for someone making correct decisions. And the act of agency, the act of free will and choice will always be embedded into the use of technology. All the security policy in the world is only good as a force multiplier. It is not in and of itself sufficient without human participation. So my genuine request to all members of the audience, please care, please try, inject yourself into the decision-making cycle and become an active participant in preserving identity security so that you can preserve safety and data and financials as are required. The freedom to choose is what is targeted almost all the time by malicious actors. So several prior rounds of webinars in this series have laid out the threats of phishing and of malware and key logging and remote controls. Those are all attempts to circumvent security technology by using human factors instead. Last sentence I tossed on here was that knowledge about these topics acts like a vaccine. It prevents future bad events from taking place. And it is very important to not get caught in a reactive posture trying to undo damage after it's already happened. We need to act in advance and tighten up identity security practices so that safety is an ongoing present concern, not something that you have to try and force into place after events have already been bad. This is rule number 2. Every identity must be distinct, and identities that have any special powers need to be segregated away into their own separate categories, their own separate usernames. So there is a temptation, a very widespread one, to use shared accounts. Resources that need to be shared exist throughout business environments. The correct way to access those resources, let's say a set of files for which an entire department of a company needs to use, or an email box for communication to other entities outside your company, that is not named after a person, but is named after a function. Invoices, accounts payable, marketing, those kind of email boxes. The correct way to use those resources is to delegate permissions to access the content to specific accounts identifiable to every person. Until you cross that minimum structural threshold, you don't have an audit trail that works. And as long as identities cannot be narrowly defined and distinctly targeted to be specific individuals, there is no pattern of responsibility. There is no ability to discover what may have happened in an environment and use resources correctly over time. There's a little bit more flexibility in the home and consumer context around this. For instance, a household account to something like a banking service can make sense, where the adult members of a household may use a single login, a single identity to touch that banking service. But where possible, it is still smarter to split up and make those identities distinct. This can happen through household grouping features and use of different profiles. And lots of services make sure this is easy to do now, things like Amazon households and Microsoft households. So while there's a little more flexibility for more than one person to share home user content, there should be no flexibility at all and no ambiguity at all left to thrive within business use content or government use content. Accounts that I've labeled here as daily driver accounts, or another name for them is productivity accounts, need to be kept very separate from admin accounts. The usernames need to be different, and a very simple way to accomplish that distinction is to put something like .adm or .admin at the end of a username that has administrative permissions. The single greatest risk factor is probably email. Any account that is able to access email is subject to a lot of exposure to security risks, and that same user account should not have the ability to take administrative actions, because accounts that log into email are the most likely to be compromised, the most likely to be stolen. You don't want to make the job very easy to allow someone who steals an email account through low effort phishing techniques to then be able to use that same account to go access privileged data and destroy contents and move around inside an environment. Right behind that is local login to computer environments. If you're doing that as an administrator to that system, that's already a degree of risk. If you're doing it as an administrator on multiple systems, something like a domain account that can move around and look at other content or owns databases, that's a completely unacceptable risk, because any piece of malware that manages to get onto the local session can steal those credentials and pivot forward in the environment. So any place you encounter where identities are combined today and the same account that is used for productivity tasks has administrative permissions needs to be separated in half. A new administrative account needs to be created, and the permissions need to be stripped away from the daily driver accounts. Rule 3, it's all about the life cycle of credentials: creating, storing, and utilizing our devil's bargain that we can't walk away from: passwords and passphrases. And this is probably where we're going to spend the most time overall today, is discussing this topic. And it is also a topic that has been brought up in multiple prior webinars. The advice given there is entirely correct around passphrases being significantly preferable to passwords. A passphrase is a compound of multiple words where you create multiple dictionary words adjacent to each other and increase the overall length of that login secret, compared to a password being generated out of characters that are not really recognizable and, sticking to a shorter length. Password lengths often cap out at 12 or 14. Passphrases should go to the 50 to 100 character range where required. The mathematical complexity embedded into a passphrase is just better, almost unbelievably better than something you can create in a password, in terms of rendering those secrets impervious to being brute forced in the future. Another key point that's been brought up before, but genuinely bears repeating: anytime you reuse credentials is pretty much a death knell to any concept of successful identity security. Every account, every identity needs unique login secrets. You have to account for the risk that all of those identities are often held at third-party locations, third-party companies. You don't own those secrets in a permanent sense. The systems of record, the places those digital identities are defined, sit on other people's computers, which means you need to handle what the outcome of another person's computer getting breached and your credentials being stolen would do to you. If every service has a completely unique login secret, then the impact or the possible scope of having a secret stolen is limited to that one service. If instead that is reusable in more places, and I can guess based on an initial set of credential theft, how to use that on an email address or how to use that on a banking site, how to transit to other locations, I can do a lot more damage as an adversary. What hasn't been mentioned before, at least I didn't see it in the prior content, is that the prior practices around forcing passwords to expire are no longer a correct security posture. And this has become fairly universally settled within the last 3 to 4 years worth of concrete research and is now codified into all major security standards published by organizations like NIST and the Department of Defense. Password expirations and forced rotations cause almost nothing besides people choosing extremely predictable patterns. If I chose a password that was something like the word tree, I would suffix it with the month and year where I was being required to do it. Tree 11/2020. Next month was reset, tree 12/2020, so on and so on. That greatly degrades the effectiveness of using a high quality passphrase in the first place. So if you are encountering any locations where passwords are being forcibly expired, please push back against those decisions and ask security stakeholders to evaluate updating those underlying policies so that complexity requirements on the front end are a substitute for password expiration in the middle tier. A long, sufficiently complex passphrase that is monitored for its use over time is vastly more secure than a shorter, continuously expiring password. Final point here, at least on this slide, generating new identity secrets. It is very bad to encounter a system that has a length requirement. That's usually an indication of less than spectacular technical competence on the part of the people who run that system. The length of a password should not have a relationship to how it is stored, because mathematically, passwords are not supposed to be stored directly themselves. They're supposed to be run through other functions that turn them into a fixed length hash value. We don't need to really dig into that today. It's just saying length requirements are no longer rational technical details. It is possible to use password managers, which we're going to talk about on the next slide, to generate passwords if you are facing a length requirement. So if you encounter something that says this can be no longer than 16 characters, randomly generating a password that is 16 characters, the maximum length allowed, and is built out of numbers, uppercase letters, lowercase letters, and symbols is the best you're going to be able to do. However, the most preferable method of generating passphrases is, in my opinion, something called diceware. This is using physical dice as a source of real-world randomness. You roll 5 6-sided dice at a time to generate a 5-digit number and use that to go into a lookup table, a dictionary of known words, and create a randomly generated passphrase out of defined known words. Doing it in the physical world can take some time. So I have found and been leveraging for probably 4 or 5 years the website that you see printed here on the slide, and these slides will be made available after the presentation, so you don't have to worry about copying down that link. Something coded by a man named Glenn Remke, who created a small local JavaScript application that runs in your browser. None of this data gets transmitted across the internet, that lets you generate secure passphrases of arbitrary length, 6 words, 8 words, 10 words at a time. You can run through candidates one after another until you find one that contains words that are acceptable or, are known to you for how to spell them. And since we noted that identity sprawl is a real thing, you will have tens to hundreds of identities to handle. A tool like this to create the identity secrets in the first place and make it so you don't have to fall prey to human pattern recognition, the limited creativity of a single human mind, is extremely useful. It wins back time in your favor. So continuing right along, password managers. They're the only reasonable solution to the fact that human memory capacity is limited. And if we accept the underlying truth that every password needs to be unique, it would be impossible to remember 400, 600 unique passwords. That is not a feat that any neurotypical human is capable of. Password managers are pieces of software that allow you to record credentials and secrets. Good password managers will have this list of features that's here on the screen, including a zero-knowledge architecture, where the password manager and your master password encrypt the local contents, and the service provider who runs that software and provides it to you has no ability at all to decrypt it. You control the keys, you control the data, and it never leaves your devices in unencrypted form. Multifactor authentication to access the manager, synchronizing contents across devices, auto-filling contents into applications and websites for you so that you don't have to worry about the threat of keyloggers in most instances. So on and so on throughout this feature list. We don't need to itemize all of it. When you go to choose a master password, it is very important to make sure you are selecting a highly, highly secure passphrase. Dead minimum, 7 words. No substitutes, no alternatives, 7 words. It's not that hard to memorize that single 7-word passphrase when that becomes the gatekeeper to all of your others. You reduce the burden on your memory by no longer having to track any downstream password contents, and just instead know that one 7-word master password. Most people I've seen can memorize that with a high degree of accuracy within about 14 to 21 days after establishing it. I listed some of the trusted major players in this space, companies like Dashlane, LastPass, 1Password, Bitwarden, and Keeper. They all have minor degrees of feature variance and pros and cons. They all have different license costs for some of the higher end paid features, but all of those are competent and roughly feature equivalent and meet our list of requirements over on the left side. A lot of people are now encountering that their web browsers are offering to save passwords for them, but that really isn't sufficient as a password manager and isn't an acceptable substitute, largely because of 3 things. Web browser password storage is not zero knowledge. Web browser password storage does not allow you to ever use those autofill capabilities in other environments, like mobile applications on a phone that aren't part of a web browser, which most certainly still require entering credentials. And web browsers do not allow you to do granular permission controls, where the highest security secrets inside the password manager should require re-authentication even if the password manager was already open. So those are all missing sets. The one outlier I do want to call out here is the Apple keychain. It is, in most ways, a fully featured password manager that meets our list of requirements. The one downside to that keychain is there is no cross-platform use. If you are not using an Apple hardware with iOS or Mac OS as its operating system, the keychain is inaccessible to you. So if you are a person who, through whatever set of reasons and hardware acquisition choices, exists 100% within the Apple ecosystem, and that is not going to change for multiple years at a time, the keychain could be a successful way to implement password management. But for most folks who will at least once in a while have to encounter a non-Apple device, preserving your identity security means you need a piece of software for password management that is applicable to a wider variety of platforms. Here's rule 4, multi-factor authentication, and that it needs to be universal. To set the stage, we're using the same underlying username password authentication structure that has been around since the 1970s and releases of Unix like version 6. They make binary state decisions about if you provide the two pieces of data, a username and a login secret, then authentication proceeds successfully. And that is insufficient to protect digital resources in a modern operating environment where passwords get breached and stolen very consistently from third-party providers, and where malware and phishing attempts can cause you to accidentally or unknowingly disclose your password to an adversary. Multi-factor authentication inserts additional layers into the authentication decision chain. Instead of the username and the password being something that you already know, some piece of knowledge that you must provide, you start by adding two-factor authentication, most common implementation. The additional layer is then something you have. You must prove possession in addition to knowledge before authentication is allowed to proceed forward. The implementation options to do this include time-based one-time password codes. Those are 6 to 8 digit strings that rotate every 30 to 60 seconds and are shown to you either inside of an authenticator application on a mobile phone or are kept on a hardware security device, a little key you take around with you. And the identity management system receiving your authentication attempt also runs the same background mathematical calculation as the application showing you the live code. Basically, each side independently calculates what that 6-digit code is during a 60-second time window and requires entry of the current valid code plus minus a small number of time drifts, such as T-1 or T-2 valid codes before, just to make sure that, small number of seconds of offset don't break a otherwise valid authentication attempt. This is an incredible security upgrade compared to someone being able to take your password alone. Other options here that are more convenient and actually more secure than just one-time password codes are authenticator apps that run on smartphones and provide push notifications, are the use of biometric scanning on different devices from fingerprint, from facial recognition, from retinal scans, or best of all, there are hardware keys. Yubico makes a product called the YubiKey that is one of the largest players in this environment, and they are cryptographically secure, standards compliant devices that if you prove you possess them, that is a very, very high-end security authentication check, because the devices are manufactured in such a way that it is nearly impossible to replicate one. And ownership of that device is very direct proof that you are the correct owner of the digital identity in question. I do want to call out not to use SMS messaging for two-factor or multi-factor authentication wherever possible. That is because it is far, far too easy to take over SMS messaging for a specific cell phone number, usually through social engineering of someone at your cell phone provider, calling up their technical support line or bribing a store employee. If I can cause your cell phone number to be redirected to a new SIM card, something I control as the attacker, I will receive your one-time codes. You will not. It will happen invisibly in the background without any warnings to you. And the degree of simplicity around performing an attack like that means SMS messaging is really no longer a trustworthy choice for MFA. All right, we're in the home stretch now. Probably just 7-8 more minutes to go. Rule 5, how to improve and evolve past just the baselines we've set: password management, unique credentials, distinct identities, multi-factor authentication. I'm going to suggest 3 subsets of Rule 5, 3 evolution paths that are all achievable with correct implementation work right now today, and that all represent a big upgrade in identity security. The first of those is single sign-on. Consolidate your use of a digital identity to one highly secure, trusted identity that is then mapped for access access to multiple kinds of downstream resources. This works extremely well for businesses. It is somewhat applicable to home environments using things like sign-on with Google, sign-on with Facebook. Those are single sign-on systems. I've had people in the past ask me whether this violates the uniqueness requirements before, where every identity needs to be distinct and every password, every secret needs to be separate. And the answer is that no, it actually doesn't, because this takes the authentication decision layer up and separates it out, abstracts it away from the actual data set or the actual application being accessed. By using a better single identity provider, something that has all of these security practices in place, you get a way higher degree of overall identity security through the use of single sign-on compared to fracturing individual identities downstream. And if nothing else, this is a really big quality of life improvement, because in a business environment in particular, you can go throughout your workday touching all sorts of different applications and data sets without having to be constantly re-challenged for separate, distinct identity prompts over and over and over. And as long as the underlying security policies are good enough, single sign-on is a highly trustworthy and good overall posture improvement for identity security. Next subset, conditional access. That refers to real-time assessment of risk and trust for each and every authentication attempt. The name I've chosen here is one that is used in the Microsoft ecosystem. There are other names for this same underlying technology, something like risk-based sign-in or flexible sign-in policies. Those are names from the Amazon AWS and IBM Cloud worlds specifically, but they all boil down to be the same thing. Instead of authentication being decided as this yes-no binary state, where in the pre-authentication moment, you are not authenticated, you cross over whatever number of factors, passwords, and additional factors are required, and then that's it. Authentication is complete. You have full and unrestricted access. Go for it. Conditional access makes authentication decisions fall on a movable spectrum where real-time decisions about the risk associated with an individual authentication attempt are applied and change the outcome to be something other than just a straight yes. You can say, okay, with the current level of trust you've established, you will be allowed to authenticate to certain low priority resources, but not yet to high sensitivity data. This relies upon collecting additional signals. So I put some examples here on the slide. We won't spend too much time digging into them, but useful signals are things like, what is the source of the request? Did it come from a company-owned, directly managed device? And did it come from a location in the world where you would expect people to reside? Or is this an anonymous, strange computer from another continent entirely? That would be a downgrade in a degree of trust. Temporal signals around what time of day, how long since last login, how often do you normally use this account? Those can all be considered. Device health. Can your device attest that it is free of malware and up to date on security patches prior to allowing a login attempt to proceed? And destination sensitivity. How secret, how dangerous is the data set that you're trying to get to with the authentication attempt? If it is just something like a single read-only PDF document, maybe that's not dangerous. If it's direct access to a sales and customer database, that's highly dangerous. If it's an administrative panel that decides security policy and active trust for lots of systems at once, that's the maximum degree of dangerous. So escalating the number of signals that need to be passed successfully in response to the degree of sensitivity of the information is part of making identity security better. And this can be implemented pretty gracefully. The technologies have matured a lot where this used to be either an extremely high cost or extremely high complexity solution. This is available to almost any company that wants to use it. Not much of this content has come into the personal realm yet, though Major identity providers like Microsoft personal accounts and Google accounts and Apple IDs are starting to try and use more signal types and more decisions around authentication on your behalf, even if you don't get direct control over those underlying policy statements. Final subset of evolution I want to list here is passwordless authentication. This is an authentication scheme that replaces the use of a passphrase, the knowledge-based check providing something you know in advance, with alternative authentication factors that are based either on ownership, as in the presence, the real-time presentation of a predefined object, or on inheritance, factors that inherit to you things like your biometric signals, your fingerprints or your other content, or a security certificate that has been assigned to you. For passwordless authentication to succeed, multi-factor authentication still has to be retained. Passwordless authentication can never be a single signal event. It must have multiple factors involved that are all alternatives to entering a passphrase. But the outcome of choosing this kind of identity security implementation is extremely pleasant. How it works, at least in what I would call the most mature real-world implementation presented by Microsoft and its Azure Active Directory online authentication system, is that when you are prompted for login, there's a username field. You enter the correct username. And instead of the next step being enter a login secret, a passphrase, the next step becomes you are shown a 2-digit number code with a short lifetime validity. And an authentication secret is presented to you on a device that you need to own, something like a Microsoft Authenticator app over on your smartphone. And you need to match one of 3 possible presentations of 2-digit options. So you prove ownership over the device in question, and you prove inheritance of the signal of identifying a correct 2-digit code live and in real time. Without having to type any password data, only a username, you proceed forward with a highly validated identity, security, and authentication attempt and can go on way, way faster through life. And this book ends nicely with the longer your passphrases are, the less you want to have to type them. They will still structurally exist. Extremely few systems in the world have replaced passphrases entirely and no longer have them as part of a identity record defining a specific digital identity at all, but their use is starting to go away. Google's not too far behind on this, by the way. Personal Google accounts as well as G Suite accounts can experience a very similar passwordless authentication workflow based on challenges, inheritance, biometrics, and certainly save you a lot of trouble for being able to not have to do that manual entry of a passphrase or the insertion of a passphrase from a password manager. Worth noting here, these suggestions around Rule 5 are a living list. They represent what my knowledge would suggest are the best practices relative to 2020, but in the future, they might change and be different. 5 years from now or 10 years from now, these could all be baseline suggestions, and there could be whole new technologies that replace them. And here's the ending point around Rule 6. Taking ownership, being proactive, involving yourself in the ongoing management of your digital identities is worthwhile. And I'd suggest a few accurate implementation steps that everyone can follow. To start with, don't stall. Demographically speaking, the unfortunate reality is that if there were 100 attendees on this call, probably 92 to 94 of them would today be reusing short passwords in multiple places, not storing contents in a password manager, and not using multi-factor authentication. Begin with email as the security core, because all of the future identity improvements and things like setting new accounts up and setting up new login credentials rely on email as their core authentication method. So start there, make sure your email accounts are extremely secure and follow all the other best practices, and then just pick a password manager and start going. Every time you go to log into a service throughout your day-to-day life, instead of just logging in, go hit the reset my password button, use either a diceware generator or a password manager, password creator to create a new login secret, store it in the manager, and then once you're logged in, if that service offers multi-factor authentication, go turn it on. Takes maybe 120, 180 extra seconds per service you touch, and you'll just start chunking through it. If you try and take this all on as one day's work, a discrete start and end process where you're saying, I'm insecure in my identity now and I'm going to get there by the end of today, that's not feasible or practical. But involving it in your moment-to-moment activities across the course of 1 month, 2 months, you'll actually end up at an almost fully implemented state through just small, minuscule changes in habits that aren't inconvenient in really any way. You should also assess existing credentials via some services like Troy Hunt's amusingly named Have I Been Pwned site. Troy is a security researcher. He has compiled together different batches of data from prior cybersecurity breaches on different governments and corporate entities and created a searchable database of not just email addresses and identities that may have been involved in those breaches, but also passwords and whether they have ever appeared before. There's a lot of high-end security that goes into being able to submit a password to a service like this and trust that it is safe and evaluated only locally within your browser session. But it does exist. This has been coded well. And you can go to Troy's site and you can type in passwords or passphrases you are using today and see if they have ever been found in any prior data breach. If they have, it is extremely important to change them right now, because the presence of the codex, the background codex of more than 1 billion with a B unique passwords that have been disclosed out to the world means that brute force attacks, where attackers just try running through combinations of prior known simple passwords with different combinations of usernames that might use them, become very successful. And any previously disclosed password can no longer be trusted to be safe. It has to be generated again to be unique. Longest list on here is configuring alerts around your identities and making sure to act on them. That's part of this proactive, ongoing monitoring event. I listed out different categories of events that you want to look for. The two that are color-coded in red are there because I think they would be the largest red flags. If you receive a notification from a service that your primary email address or your primary mobile phone number on your existing digital identity has been changed, that is a very high-risk situation, because those are usually the methods that allow an attacker to then use a different reference identity they control, an email address or a contact number, to go and take over these identities that you care about. And the final note that I tossed on here is, depending on how much exposure to risk you have, your net worth or your business's net worth, it's very important to harden financial controls early in these steps. A lot of cybersecurity activity and malicious activity is targeting financial gain as its ultimate desired outcome, and making sure that you have direct best practices in place for identities that have the ability to manipulate money. Yeah, I think that's fairly self-explanatory. That's the core of the presentation I wanted to talk about today. My email address will be here on the screen if there are questions that come to mind later not related to the webinar right now. But that is the end of what I wanted to speak to, and let's turn this over to question and answers from chat or the minds of attendees.
JR, I want to thank you again. That was a great presentation, and I liked how you tied it into a lot of the content we've heard previously. In some of the other presentations, there was discussion around passwords and password managers, and the theme of today's presentation, securing digital identities, goes right along in parallel with that. So thank you for that and the work you put in to presenting that information to everybody. There were a couple questions that came in on the Q&A from Aubrey. She says, how can I keep track of all these different passphrases? And I want to add something to her question, because as you talked through some of the password managers, kind of an additional question to that. Well, first of all, how do we keep track of it? Second of all, if we are using one of those password manager tools like LastPass, Keeper, some of those, maybe a follow-up question to that is it possible for a hacker to get into a password manager and then get your password? So kind of that fear of, if you're putting all your eggs in one basket, so to speak, in a password manager, Is that risky? Talk through kind of some of the security implications in that, if you would.
Excellent questions, highly deserving of consideration. The core method to remember and organize the content is indeed a password management system. The security risk of consolidating those various secrets together into one manager is one that is actually worthwhile into correct and grand evaluation, because all other available alternatives that don't allow completely unique passwords to be set and for long, high complexity objects to be in use everywhere are just worse off than having a password manager in place. The key steps are to make sure that the manager is the highest security and highest protected identity of them all. Since that master identity that gets you into your password manager has downstream access, that is one that must have a nice long passphrase. That is one that from the first day you turn it on, you need to use multi-factor authentication. And that is one that on balance makes your life a lot better than just trying to remember alternative systems or do something like a physical record into a notebook and that kind of thing. I will say there are identities that are so privileged and so secret, they require additional protection inside of a password manager. And I can think of two ways to do that. One of them is flagging them inside the same password manager account that you use for other identities with extra security verifications, requiring manual reentry of something like the master passphrase to interact with those specific credentials. The other is, and this is something that was suggested in the October 11th webinar, you can segregate password management tools based on levels of risk. So one extra tool that I could toss into the mix for people to consider is if they have credentials that they are completely uncomfortable storing in a password manager run by another company that involves any third-party provider at all, a tool like KeePass, that is spelled KeePass, is valuable. That is a local client that executes software on machines you control and install and creates an encrypted database file which other KeePass clients can open, which has master passwords and multi-factor authentication able to be used locally, but is never transmitted outside storage resources that you control and you directly own. So that is an alternative to hold certain types of secrets if you don't want to entrust them to third-party providers is a good way to go. But on balance, security is a spectrum. There is no perfect and 100% answer, and the 98th percentile answer is a password manager. It's the best overall solution considering all the risks and the benefits.
I just want to reemphasize something you said, that when you're using a password manager, you don't want it to be just a simple short password that we might instinctively plug into our Netflix account or anything like that. But the password manager really needs to be the most secure, robust passphrase you can use. So I want to reemphasize that point. Going on to some additional questions, thinking a little bit more broadly, if you can expand on something you mentioned in your presentation about the types of identities that need upgraded protection. So if we all think of it as, well, I as an individual and my business and my employees, we all have digital identities in one form or another. Are there certain kinds of identities that need additional protection that we need to be more thoughtful about how we secure those?
Yep. We flagged out during the presentation administrative level identities and how they need to be completely separate accounts, not the same usernames, and those need to receive the best case, highest end security policies straight away. Don't need to beat a dead horse there. We did flag out just a moment ago and call special attention to the identity that unlocks the password manager. That is also a extremely high security, high value identity. Past that, email, because that account forms the security nexus for how all other password resets and account creation flows. If you don't have great security and control over your own email addresses, you're going to be 5 steps behind. Banking accounts or financial accounts that have the direct ability to cause money transfers. So in a lot of cases, credit card logins don't necessarily fall into this category, but bank savings accounts, certificate deposits, and stock brokerage logins do, where ACH transfer processes or other money confirmation and sending tools need to be protected with high-end security. That then extends onward into payment services, Zelle, PayPal, Venmo, that are very commonly in use. And in the business side of the house, the accounts inside of accounting and ERP systems, QuickBooks, SAP, so on and so on, that have immediate direct control over money transfers. Those are all identity categories that I would flag as make sure they have special protection.
Excellent. Thank you, JR. Maybe one final question before we sign off here. Talking about identities that can be stolen, and I guess kind of a two-part question. One, can you give some examples of ways that identities can be stolen and what the repercussions are? And maybe another way to frame that is, what's the worst case scenario for a business and what do we need to avoid? What risks are at stake? So maybe thinking of ways to sort of tie those two questions together.
I'd like to talk about this in, honest and open candor, not relying on any scare tactics or any other hyperbole. The risks at stake for a business are usually existential. They usually decide whether the business gets to be a going concern in the future or not. Reason I say that, if I am a malicious actor and I want to come and steal identities that don't have good security practices, I would start by getting access to someone's email if they are an important employee to the company, a chief executive of some kind, an operations director, or an IT administrator. I would use that identity and its ability to send communications to start communicating other malicious actions to additional employees. Send them maybe loaded attachments that set off malware, or trick the original account holder into opening and running a piece of remote control software, or use a remote access tool like a VPN, where that same business identity gets me access into a private business network from somewhere external out on the internet to start compromising additional systems. When I'm inside a business system, the damage I can do falls into basically three categories, I would think. I can steal money just outright, make financial transfers that are one-way wire transfers and are not really reclaimable without highly successful interventions in litigation and banking processes that are not completely trustworthy. It's not like you'll experience the level of protection most people do on consumer credit cards. I could exfiltrate data. I could go get valuable intellectual property, customer lists, personally identifiable information, private pricing data, pre-lease product plans, all sorts of this business data that has tangible monetary value from a market capitalization perspective. Exfiltrate a copy and then blackmail the company. Threaten to release it to competitors, to journalists, in order to extract payment and further compliance. Or probably the highest end threat of all, ransomware. I can use my ability to go around and take over powerful, insecure digital identities to execute malware that destroys and locks out access to company data, that brings day-to-day operations to a grinding halt, and then demands a ransom payment in order to potentially decrypt data and get content back. Wherever possible, a business does not want to be facing that situation. You want to secure identity well enough to not have ransomware go off, and if you find later that it does go off, contain the damage, do not pay the ransom, and proceed with restoration based on other plans. We have some content over at the PSI blog site that was published just last month as part of Cybersecurity Awareness Month on that exact ransomware topic. And they can lay out maybe in a little more detail some of those stakes, but they really are existential to a company. The ability to continue existing with financial health, customer trust, and be a going concern can be stripped away from you through the malicious use of insecure digital identities.
Wonderful, JR. Thank you again. That's all the time we have for today's webinar. We want to thank you and all the folks at Perpetual Storage for the hard work you've putting together this presentation and also the general work you guys provide over there. Thank you very much, JR, for your time, and also to our participants. It's been a great discussion, and we're very fortunate to be able to benefit from your expertise today, JR. Thank you.
It's nice to talk, and thank you to the Chamber for hosting this series. It's valuable knowledge that we should talk about more.
Thank you. I also want to thank our Respond level sponsor, Strong Connections. So that's all for today. Just want to remind everyone we have one more of these webinars next Wednesday at noon. It'll be the last one in the series in our fall Cybersecurity Leadership Council conference. So thank you again for everyone who attended. We'll see you all next week.